Nobody in Miles City understood why the richest rancher in 3 counties stopped for a freezing stranger at midnight. Caleb Whitfield had spent his entire life making careful decisions, yet the moment he saw Delia Fontaine sitting alone in the snow with nothing but an old medical case in her arms, he took off his own coat and refused to ride away. The town saw a woman with nowhere to go. Caleb saw someone worth protecting long before he realized she would become the greatest love of his life. The stagecoach from Bozeman had let her off an hour before dark, and by midnight the cold had gone past hurting and into something quieter. Delia Fontaine sat against the wall of the mercantile with her father's medical case in her lap, both arms locked around it, and told herself she only needed to rest until sunrise when the eastbound train might finally clear the drifts blocking the line at Forsyth. She'd left Natchez with that case $40 sewn into her hem and nothing else worth naming. The $40 had clung to the stage line and a meal she couldn't remember tasting. The case was not negotiable. It had her father's name burned into the leather, and inside it wrapped in oilcloth the surgical tools and remedies that were the only proof left in the world that Isaiah Fontaine had trained a nurse worth trusting. 2 men came out of the saloon across the street, unsteady, loud one of them, pointing at her like she was a thing left out in the weather. "Somebody ought to move that," he said, and laughed at his own joke. "Leave her be Dutch," the other one muttered, though he didn't move to help either. That was when the rider came down the street, a big man on a big gray horse moving slow enough that his shadow reached her before he did. He swung down without hurry, and the 2 men by the saloon went quiet the way men do when they recognize somebody they owe money to or want to. "Caleb," Dutch said, half a question, straightening up. He didn't answer them. He crouched in front of Delia close enough that she could see his eyes were gray too and steady. "Ma'am, you hurt or just cold?" "Cold," she said, because her jaw had stopped working right, and it was the shortest true word she had. "How long you been sitting here?" "Since the 4 o'clock stage." She tried to make it sound less foolish than it felt. The eastbounds delayed. Snow on the line past Forsyth. The station agent said there wasn't a room to be had in town tonight. "There's a room," Caleb said. "It's just not one he was fixing to rent you." He didn't say it with anger, only the flat certainty of a man stating a fact about the place he lived. He shrugged out of his coat and put it around her shoulders like it was the only sensible thing to do, and it probably was. "Can you stand?" "I can stand." She proved it, though it cost her one hand still locked around the case. He walked her across to the hotel, one hand near her elbow, but not touching unless she swayed. The clerk behind the desk, a thin man named Abernathy, looked up and began, "Now I don't rightly know if we've got room and something hot," Caleb said. "I'll settle it." He set 2 coins on the counter before Abernathy could finish the sentence, and Abernathy, weighing the coins against whatever objection he'd been about to raise, decided the coins won. Upstairs, with a fire going and coffee she held with both hands, Caleb pulled a chair back from the small table but didn't sit, like he meant to leave the moment he was satisfied she was warm enough. "What's in the case you wouldn't let go of, even half froze?" "My father's medical instruments. He was a physician in Natchez. I trained under him." She said it flatly, the way people say things they've had to defend before. "I was a nurse there myself at St. James Hospital." Was. She didn't explain further, and he didn't push through. Something in his face said he'd noted the word and set it aside to ask about later. He studied her a moment, not the way the men outside had looked at her sizing up trouble, but the way a man looks at a fence line working out what it would take to fix it. "There's no doctor between here and Fort Keogh," he said. "I run cattle north of town. 60 men on my payroll, and one of them breaks something new most every month. Had a fever take a boy last winter because nobody knew to send for help in time." "Is that an observation, Mr. Whitfield?" "Caleb Whitfield." He picked his hat up off the table, turned it once in his hands. "Get some sleep. I've got business to see to at first light, But I'll come back around 7 if you're still here. Where else would I go? He didn't have an answer for that. And for the first time since he'd found her, something like a smile moved across his face before he caught it. At the door, he paused. Abernathy'll knock if you need anything through the night. Tell him Caleb Whitfield's paying, and he'll mind his manners. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. Sleep, he said again, and left her the coat. She sat by the fire long after he'd gone, turning the coat over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the deep pockets, the collar worn soft from years of use. It smelled of horse and wood smoke and cold iron, nothing like New Orleans, and nothing like disgrace. Outside, she could hear Dutch and his companion still talking somewhere down the street, their voices smaller, now chastened. For the first time in 3 weeks, Delia let herself close her eyes without listening for footsteps behind her. He came back at 7 before she'd finished the coffee the hotel had sent up, and got straight to it the way she was starting to understand he got to everything. Crown W. That's my outfit north of town, 2 hours ride. He didn't sit, just stood near the window with his hat in his hand. I need somebody who can set a bone stitch a wound and tell a fever from a chill before it kills somebody. Pays $12 a month a cabin to yourself and meals with the crew if you want them. Or Ruth Ann, she runs the kitchen, will send a plate over if you don't. Delia set the cup down carefully. You don't know anything about me, Mr. Whitfield. I know you didn't let go of that case in a snowbank at midnight. That tells me plenty. It tells you I'm stubborn. Same thing where I'm from. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, a rough tally injuries logged over the last winter in a foreman's cramped hand. 3 broken bones. A gash gone bad that had cost a man 2 fingers because nobody had known to clean it right. A fever that had taken a boy of 19, name of Cy Waters, because the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride and came a day late. She read it twice, her thumb resting on the boy's name. This isn't charity. Didn't say it was. People will assume it is. A man like you taking in a woman like me, giving her a wage and a roof. Caleb didn't flinch from that the way she half expected, half hoped, so she'd have a reason to be angry instead of hopeful. People assume a lot of things that aren't my business to correct for them, he said. I've got 60 men who need somebody who knows what she's doing more than I need the town's good opinion of how I hire my help. She looked at the tally again, at Cy Waters' name, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel since the morning they'd read her dismissal aloud in a room full of men who wouldn't say her name right. Being needed for what she actually knew instead of forgiven for what she was. I have conditions, she said. Go on. I run my own clinic. Nobody tells me how to treat a patient because they don't like the color of my hands doing it. If a man questions my judgment, he takes it up with me, not around me. Done. I'm not anybody's charity case, and I won't be spoken of as one in front of your men. Not by them, and not by you. You won't be. He said it plainly, no oath behind it, which somehow made her believe it more than if he'd sworn to it on a Bible. And if it doesn't work, if your men won't have a woman looking after them, then you'll tell me and I'll pay your fare back to wherever you'd rather be. But I don't expect that's how it'll go. He set his hat back on. I've got a wagon downstairs if you're ready. Otherwise, the noon stage north leaves without me, and I'd as soon not wait another day to get you settled before the weather turns again. She thought of the alternative. Another stagecoach, another town, another set of doors closing before she'd finished knocking. All right, she said. $12 the cabin, and I'll want a proper room for the work. Not a corner of the barn, and not a shelf in somebody's pantry. You'll have it built by the time you need it. I'll have Ezra Hollis, my foreman, start on lumber this week. There's one more thing, Delia said. Medicine. I'll need a locked cabinet for it, and I'll want to place my own order with a supplier out of Helena, not whatever the ranch has been buying on credit at the Mercantile. Half the salves I've seen sold in these territories are watered down past any real use. You'll have your own account. Order what you judge fit, and send the bill to me directly, not through Ezra or anybody else. And I keep my own hours when a patient needs me. I won't have anyone telling me a fever can wait till after branding season's done. Nobody tells the weather to wait either, Caleb said. I wouldn't expect a fever to be any more reasonable than the weather is. That answer, more than anything else he'd said all morning, settled something in her chest she hadn't realized was still unsettled. She'd spent 3 weeks bracing for men who'd want to negotiate her competence down to something smaller and cheaper. He hadn't tried once. Then we understand each other, she said. We do. He held out his hand, plain and businesslike, as if the whole conversation had been no different than agreeing on a wage for a ranch hand, which she suspected was exactly how he meant it. They shook on it, her hand still cold inside his, and neither of them let go quite as fast as manners required. Outside, the street was waking up wagons and voices ordinary Montana morning Abernathy, sweeping his front step like nothing unusual had happened under his roof the night before. Delia picked up her father's case and followed a stranger north toward a life she hadn't known to hope for a week ago. Crown W sat 2 hours north of town, low buildings and a lot of open ground, and the first person Delia met there made it clear the job wasn't going to be handed to her twice. She's the nurse, Ezra Hollis asked Caleb, not her looking at Delia like she was a decision he hadn't been consulted on. She's the nurse, Caleb said. Ezra runs the crew day to day. You'll work with him more than me most weeks. Ezra's jaw worked once. No offense meant, ma'am, but the men aren't going to take kindly to a nurse who knows what she's doing, Delia said. I've heard that sentence in 6 different accents, Mr. Hollis from Natchez to the Bozeman stage line. I generally find the men change their minds faster than the man in charge does. Something crossed Ezra's face that might have been surprise, might have been the start of respect, though he covered it with a nod toward the bunkhouse and walked off to see to the horses, muttering something to himself that might have been agreement. A younger hand named Cole, leaning against the corral rail, wasn't so quiet about it. Didn't figure the boss for hiring a woman to patch us up, he said to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard. Especially not what Cole, Ruth Ann's voice cut across the yard before he finished sharp as the knife she still held from peeling potatoes. Finish that sentence where I can hear the rest of it. Cole found something urgent to do with a saddle strap instead, and didn't finish it. Delia said nothing, only watched filing away who in the yard had spoken and who hadn't, the way she'd learned to do in every new place since Natchez. The kitchen woman was a different matter entirely. Ruth Ann Boyd took one look at Delia standing uncertain in the yard, still holding her case like it might be taken from her, and put a cup of coffee in her free hand without asking. You'll want this, Ruth Ann said. Caleb doesn't warn a person how cold it stays past March out here, and he forgets other folks don't run as warm as he does. She looked her over, not unkindly. You eat with us or you eat alone, your choice, but the offer stands either way every day, no need to ask twice. I'll eat with you, Delia said, surprised at how easily it came out. Good. First one who says otherwise answers to me, and I've got a rolling pin I'm not shy about. The room Caleb had promised wasn't built yet. Just a corner of the equipment shed, dirt floor, a single shelf holding a coil of rope and a broken bridle. And looking at it, Delia felt the old doubt rise up, quick and familiar. A room like this said what people really thought before they said it in words. Caleb caught her looking. I know it's not much yet. It's not the room I'm worried about. I know that too. He didn't offer comfort for it, which she was grateful for, comfort from a man who couldn't actually fix the problem, always felt like being handled. Instead, he said, Ezra'll bring you lumber this afternoon, and Tom Ruskin will build to whatever plan you draw up. You tell them what a proper clinic needs. Not what's easy to build, what you actually need to do the work right. She hadn't been asked that in a long time. She found a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil in her case and began sketching a shelf height, a table long enough for a man to lie flat, a window positioned for light instead of view, a second door for airing the room out after a bad case. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her hand move with the same attention he'd given the injury tally that morning, like her competence was the only thing in the room worth studying. "You've done this before," he said. "Built a room from scratch. Once. My father let me design the examining room when I was 17. He said a good nurse ought to know what she needs before somebody hands it to her wrong." That afternoon, while Tom Ruskin measured the shed for shelving, Delia unpacked her father's medical case for the first time since Natchez, laying each tool out on a clean cloth to check it against the cold. The scalpel first, then the forceps, then the small tin of needles her father had carried through 2 yellow fever seasons before she was even born. Ruth Ann, passing by with a basket of laundry, stopped in the doorway and went quiet at the sight of it. "That was his," Delia said, not a question. "My grandmother's tools were like that," Ruth Ann said after a moment. "Passed to my mother, then near lost when we came west. You don't let go of a thing like that easy." "No," Delia agreed. "You don't." By evening, word had gone round the bunkhouse that the new nurse had told Ezra Hollis to his face that his men's opinions would come around on their own time. A few of them laughed about it over supper, glancing her way. None of them laughed unkindly, and Delia noticed it, the way she'd learned to notice everything now, weighing which rooms were safe before she let her shoulders drop in them. This one, she thought, watching Caleb take his plate and sit at the same rough table as his men, no separate chair for the owner, no special plate, might be safer than most she'd known. The test came 11 days later, the way tests always did on a working ranch, without warning and at the worst possible hour. Jonah Teague's horse spooked at a rattler in the brush and threw him hard against the corral rail. He came up holding his right arm wrong, the bone visibly out of true, beneath the skin, white-faced, and trying not to show how much it hurt in front of the other hands. "Get him to the shed," Delia said, already moving, already rolling her sleeves. "Ezra, I need him flat on the table. Somebody boil water, clean cloth, not the horse blankets, and get that lamp lit. The near window doesn't give enough light this time of day." A few of the men hesitated, glancing toward Caleb, like they needed permission to take orders from her. Caleb didn't give them one, he just picked up Jonah's good side and started walking, and that settled it faster than any speech could have. Inside, with Jonah biting down on a strip of leather and sweat standing on his forehead, Delia worked without hurry, though her hands moved fast. She'd splinted worse in New Orleans with less light and steadier assistance. What she didn't have here was trust. She could feel Ezra standing in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting to see if she'd fail so he could say he'd known it. "Hold his shoulder," she told Caleb. "Firm. Don't let him twist no matter what sound he makes." Caleb held. Jonah made a sound through the leather that none of them commented on, and the bone went back into line under Delia's hands, sure and exact. She built the splint from a strip of wagon board and cut down harness leather, binding it tight enough to hold, and no tighter, checking the boy's fingers twice for feeling before she was satisfied. "You'll keep this on 6 weeks," she told Jonah when his breathing had leveled out. "You so much as think about roping with that arm before I say so, I'll hear about it from every man in this bunkhouse, and you'll wish you'd broken the other one instead." Jonah managed a pale grin. "Yes, ma'am. 6 weeks." Ezra was quiet a long moment, looking at the splint, at the steadiness of it, at the boy's color coming back to his face. "Where'd you learn to build a splint like that? Never seen one held together with harness leather before." "My father taught me the bone setting. The leather I worked out myself, because in Natchez there wasn't always plaster to spare, and nobody was going to teach a woman who looked like me twice if I asked the same question." She said it without heat, just fact, and wiped her hands on a clean cloth. Ezra nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something had shifted and wouldn't need repeating. Outside, the men still gathered by the corral pressed him for word on Jonah, and Delia heard him say, plain enough to carry through the open door, "Bone set clean." She knew exactly what she was doing, every step of it. I've seen worse work done by doctors charging $5 a visit in Miles City. Cole among the group had nothing to say to that. Ruth Ann brought supper to the shed rather than make Delia leave Jonah's side, and stayed long enough to fuss over the boy until he complained she was worse than the break itself. His mother's up near Bozeman, Ruth Ann told Delia quietly, once Jonah had drifted off. Sends him a letter every month regular as church. He'll want to write her himself once that arm's steady enough to hold a pen, so mind you tell him when that day comes. I will, Delia said and meant to remember it. I could write it for him if his hand's too shaky yet, Caleb offered from the doorway, where he'd been standing longer than either of them realized. Wouldn't be the first letter I've written for a man who couldn't manage it himself. You'd do that? Delia asked, surprised though she was beginning to understand she shouldn't be. Man's got a mother worrying. Costs me nothing to put words on a page for him. He said it like it was obvious, and maybe to him it was. Ezra went to spread the word further among the men still gathered outside, and the shed emptied out until it was only Caleb and Delia and Jonah asleep from exhaustion in the corner cot. You did that like you'd done it 100 times, Caleb said. I have, more than I could count some winters, and nobody in Natchez saw fit to keep you doing it. She looked up at him then, and something passed between them that hadn't fully surfaced before, not gratitude exactly, and not pity, which she'd have refused outright. Recognition, maybe. The particular quiet of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to lie about what he saw. Neither of them looked away. Delia was aware, with a clarity that unsettled her more than the cold ever had, of how close he was standing, of the warmth still coming off him from carrying Jonah, of how little distance there was left between his hand and hers on the table. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. But something had shifted in the small room, quiet and unspoken, and both of them knew it had. Thank you, she said a little unsteadier than she meant to sound, for holding his shoulder instead of asking if I needed help. Didn't look like you needed help. Caleb held her gaze a moment longer than the sentence required, then reached for the lamp to bank it for the night. At the door he glanced back once more. Get some rest yourself. You've earned it tonight, whether anybody says so out loud or not. You just did, she said, and he almost smiled again before he left. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. It was Ruth Ann who let it slip 3 weeks later over the sound of dough being worked on the table between them. Man's been carrying that ledger around like it's a debt he owes personally, Ruth Ann said, nodding toward the main house where lamplight still burned, though it was well past supper. Ever since old Mr. Whitfield passed, going on 3 years now. What ledger? Ruth Ann's mouth flattened like she'd said more than she meant to. Ask him yourself. Not my place to carry tales, even ones I know for a fact. Delia did ask that same evening when she brought a cup of willow bark tea over for Caleb's knee, which he favored more than he'd admit after a long day in the saddle. She found him at the kitchen table with a heavy book open in front of him, columns of figures in a hand she guessed was his father's, and a paper beside it, with a wax seal broken at one corner. Ruth Ann mentioned a ledger. Caleb's hand went briefly still over the page before he closed it. My father's terms. The Miles City Bank holds the note on this place, has since, before I was born, renewed every few years on his word and Silas Pruitt's good graces. My father's arrangement, agreed to before he died, was that the note gets renewed easy if the Whitfield name marries into banking money. Keeps everything in the family, so to speak, and keeps Pruitt's bank the only one this ranch ever does business with. And if it doesn't marry into banking money, then Pruitt's under no obligation to renew on the terms we've had. He can call the whole note due whenever it suits him, and I don't have that kind of cash sitting in a strongbox, not with the herd not shipping till fall. He said it evenly, a man reciting a fact he'd made peace with, or told himself he had. I was engaged 2 years back, Eleanor Marsh out of Billings. Her father does business with Pruitt's Bank, sits on the same charter board. What happened? Her father wanted grazing rights along the North Range that weren't mine to give away land. The Crow families have wintered their horses on every year since, before my father ever filed his claim. I said no. Eleanor's father called it bad business sense, said I was throwing away the family's standing over land that wasn't legally anybody's, but ours on paper. I called it the only decision I could live with and still call myself my father's son in any way that mattered. He looked up at her. County's called me difficult ever since. Pruitt's been waiting 2 years for me to need him badly enough to reconsider. How much does the note come to? Delia asked. If you don't mind my asking plainly. 11,000 give or take what the spring shipping brings in. He said the number without flinching, the way a man says a number he's said to himself too many times already. Not a fortune by Eastern standards. Enough to end this place if it came due all at once and I couldn't cover it. Delia set the tea down slowly. And you never have. Not yet. Something in the way he said it made her look at him harder, and he held her look instead of glancing away, which was its own kind of answer. Why tell me this now? You could have let it be Ruth Ann's half a story and left it there. Because you asked plainly, and I don't much care anymore for how many things I've let myself not say plainly to you or to anybody else on this place. He turned the ledger a quarter turn, like he might open it again, then didn't. My father built this place hard, and he wanted it kept exactly the way he'd have kept it, every acre, every note, every decision made to please a bank instead of a neighbor. I've spent 2 years trying to be a different kind of man on the same land, and Pruitt's just waiting to see which one of us wins out in the end. That sounds lonely. Didn't used to notice it as lonely. He didn't finish the thought, and for a moment neither of them spoke. My mother used to say a debt like that doesn't go away just because you stop looking at the paper, Delia said finally. She raised 4 of us alone after my father died, took in washing and mending, till her hands cracked in winter, and never once let us hear her call it a burden. I think she'd have liked your father's ledger about as much as you do. What would she have made of you coming all this way alone? She'd have told me pain follows the ones who know what to do with it. Said it to me more than once growing up. I used to think she meant it as comfort. Older I get, the more it sounds like a warning. Caleb almost smiled at that, though it didn't quite reach. Maybe it's both. Maybe it is. His hand had drifted an inch across the table while he spoke close enough to hers that she felt the warmth of it, before she felt anything else, and for a moment, she thought he might close the last of the distance. He didn't. He pulled his hand back to the ledger instead, as if he'd caught himself reaching for something he hadn't yet earned the right to take, and Delia found she minded the retreat more than she expected to. She didn't push him to finish his own thought, and some silences she'd learned said more honestly than words could. The wax seal on the table between them unopened, waiting for a decision neither of them named out loud that night. Though both of them understood, it had already begun to matter more than either was ready to admit. Word came from a homestead near the river that the Kessler family had 3 children down with fever and no way to get to town for the doctor, who wasn't there anyway. Delia packed her case. Caleb saddled 2 horses without being asked. You don't need to come, she told him. River's up with the melt. Crossing's tricky this time of year, and you don't know the ford. He swung up onto his horse. Not an argument, Delia. Just a fact, same as any other. She noted riding beside him that he'd used her given name the first time he had without the miss, or the careful ma'am he'd used since the station. She didn't correct him. The crossing was tricky, as promised, the water fast and cold, the horses picking their way over rock she couldn't see beneath the current. Caleb kept his mount half a length ahead of hers, the whole way, watching her more than the water calling out where the footing shifted before she felt it herself. When her horse stumbled at the far bank, his hand was already closed around her rein before she'd fully registered the misstep. I had it, she said, breathless. I know you did. He didn't let go right away, and she didn't ask him to. At the Kessler cabin, Ada Kessler met them at the door, with a lamp shaking in her hand. 3 children down with fever in a single bed behind her, and no husband home till the spring drive finished. I didn't know who else to send for, she said, half apology, half plea. "I heard there was a nurse out at the Crown W now, but I didn't know if you'd come this far for strangers. That's exactly the kind of person worth coming for," Delia said, already past her and kneeling at the bedside. She worked for 4 hours straight, fevers broken with cool cloths and careful doses of the willow bark and quinine powder she'd rationed all winter weighing in her head. Which of the 3 children needed the last of the quinine most, and settling on the youngest, whose breathing had gone thin and fast. By the second hour, his breathing had eased back to something steady, and Ada Kessler wept without trying to hide it. Delia kept working, reassuring the older 2 in the plain, unhurried voice she used for frightened people, until all 3 slept without the awful restlessness fever brings. Caleb built up the fire-hauled water from the well, held a lamp steady when she needed both hands free, and asked no questions about what he could do next. He simply watched what she needed and did it the way he'd held Jonah's shoulder, without being told twice. Partway through, Delia realized the quinine powder in her case had run down to almost nothing less than she'd thought when she packed. "I'm going to need more of this before the month's out," she said, half to herself, weighing the tin in her hand. "I should have ordered twice what I did." "Write it down," Caleb said. "I'll write it to the Helena supplier myself if the mail's too slow." "You don't need to do that." "Didn't say I needed to. Said I would." He went back to the fire without waiting for her to argue further, and she let it go, filing the offer away with all the others she was beginning to trust he meant. "What do I owe you?" Ada asked at the door, worry replaced now by a different kind of anxiousness. "Nothing tonight. If you've got eggs to spare come summer, the ranch kitchen won't turn them down." Delia packed her case, glancing back once at the 3 children sleeping easier than they had in days. "Send word if the fever comes back before I'm out this way again." "I will, and thank you. I mean that plainly, not just as a thing folks say." "I know you do," Delia said, and found she believed it. By the time they rode back, dusk was coming down fast and cold, and Ruth Ann's quilt packed without being asked. The way Ruth Ann did most things was the only thing between them and the wind at the crossing. "You didn't have to stay the whole 4 hours," Delia said when they'd stopped to let the horses breathe on the near bank. "Most men would have ridden home once the worst of the fever broke. Didn't want to be anywhere else." He said it simply the way he said most things, and then seemed to hear himself say it, and looked at her a beat too long before looking away toward the water. She felt the same catch in her own chest, and didn't examine it too closely, not yet. "Ruth Ann's going to ask a great many questions about this quilt. When we get back, you understand. She'll have the whole bunkhouse talking by breakfast. Ruth Ann asks a great many questions, regardless of what I do or don't do." A faint smile there and gone. He held out his hand to help her back into the saddle, and this time when their fingers met, neither of them moved to let go until the horses were already walking side by side back toward the Crown W, under a sky going purple at the edges. They rode the rest of the way without much talk, but it wasn't the silence of 2 strangers anymore. It was the kind that only grows between people who've already decided without saying so that they intend to keep choosing each other's company, one river crossing, one fever broken, one quiet evening at a time, however slowly. Either of them was willing to name it out loud. At the cabin door, Caleb helped her down, and this time his hands stayed at her waist, a moment longer than the dismount required. Neither of them stepped back right away. The yard was dark, the bunkhouse lamps already out, and for a long breath it seemed as though he might lean down and close the distance between them entirely. "Good night, Delia," he said instead, low, and something in his voice made the plain words sound like they cost him something to say. "Good night, Caleb." She stood in the doorway and watched him lead both horses toward the barn, and it was a long while before she stopped feeling the warmth of his hands at her waist, or the shape of the words neither of them had said. Silas Pruitt came to Crown W on the pretext of business as bankers do, with a satchel of papers about the spring note, and an eye that missed very little of what it passed over. He found Caleb and Delia in the yard, her instructing Jonah on caring for his splint. Caleb standing near enough that a blind man could have read the arrangement between them. Pruitt's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Mr. Whitfield," Pruitt said, dismounting with the careful economy of a man who never wasted a motion he hadn't planned. "And this would be your nurse." "Delia Fontaine," Caleb said. "She runs the clinic here and runs it well. Ask Jonah." "Does she?" Pruitt's gaze traveled over her unhurried cataloging, the way he might look over a horse he was deciding whether to bid on. "I understood you had a woman working the sick room. I didn't understand the arrangement went quite so far as her giving orders to your foreman's men in the open yard." "The arrangement," Caleb said, "is that she's good at her job and none of your concern otherwise, Silas." Pruitt let that sit a beat too long, then smiled thinly and turned the conversation to the note. The terms, the renewal date circled in his ledger, same as it had been circled in Caleb's father's, and left an hour later without further incident. Though Delia felt his attention on her the whole visit, the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows it plainly. Ezra watched Pruitt ride out and spat once in the dust behind him. "Man's been sniffing round this place since before your father passed Caleb. Never liked that he couldn't call every tune this ranch dances to." "He's never had to like it," Caleb said. "Just had to renew the note. And if he decides he doesn't want to renew it anymore." Caleb didn't answer that directly, and Delia noticed he didn't filing it away the way she'd learned to file away every unanswered question a man left hanging in a room. 3 weeks after that, a letter reached Pruitt's bank with a Natchez postmark, and though Delia never learned exactly who had written it, or why, whether an old colleague at St. James settling a score, or simply a clerk with a long memory for scandal, she understood the day Pruitt returned to the Crown W uninvited that someone had gone looking and found what they were looking for. "Miss Fontaine," Pruitt said in the yard again. Ezra and 2 other hands close enough to hear. "I've had some correspondence from Mississippi. Curious details about a nurse dismissed from St. James Hospital in Natchez under a cloud. Fraud, I believe the word used was. A patient's death laid squarely at her door and her license struck from the rolls for it. The words landed exactly the way they were meant to. Public sudden design to cost her standing before she could answer plainly." Delia felt her spine go straight, the old instinct from 100 rooms like this one. "That is not what happened," she said, level though her hands had gone cold at her sides. "I'm sure you'd say that, whatever the truth of it." Caleb stepped between them before she'd finished the sentence, not shielding her from the words, so much as making it clear whose yard they were standing in and whose land Pruitt was a guest on. "You rode 2 hours to repeat gossip you fished out of somebody's old grievance, Silas. I rode 2 hours because a bank doesn't extend credit to a man whose household is under a cloud of fraud, Caleb. That's not gossip. That's due diligence, plain and simple, and you'd do well to remember whose signature is on your note." Pruitt's eyes didn't leave Delia's face even as he spoke to Caleb. "I'd think carefully if I were you about who you're keeping close to this ranch and what it might cost you." He left without waiting for a reply, and the yard stayed quiet a long moment after his horse cleared the gate, Ezra and the others finding sudden business elsewhere rather than meet anyone's eye. Jonah, still favoring his mending arm, was the first to speak. "Whatever he's talking about, ma'am, don't none of us here believe a word of it." "You don't know what he's talking about yet, Jonah," Delia said more gently than the moment probably deserved. "Don't much matter. Man rode in here trying to scare a woman in front of a yard full of men. Tells me plenty about him and nothing about you." He said it plainly the way Caleb said things, and went back to his chores before she could answer. "Delia," Caleb started. "I'll tell you," she said, "all of it plainly, tonight at the house. Not standing out here in the yard for him to have gotten the last word on it in front of your men." Caleb nodded once, but she saw something new settle into his face, not doubt in her, she didn't think, but the first real weight of what Pruitt had just made plain. This wasn't a private matter between the 2 of them anymore. It belonged to the whole county now, whether either of them wanted it to or not. Before she went inside, he caught her hand once briefly, and held it. Whatever's in your past, Delia, it doesn't change one thing about who you are to this ranch or to me. I need you to hear that before tonight, not after. I hear you, she said, and for a moment let herself lean into the plain comfort of his hand around hers before she went in to wait for him at the house. By the following week, the story had traveled the way stories do in a small town, faster than truth, and considerably uglier by the time it reached the counter of the general store. Delia told Caleb everything that night at the kitchen table plainly, the fever outbreak at St. James, the white patient she'd begged the attending physician for quinine to treat properly, the physician's refusal on grounds she'd never fully understood, the death that followed within 2 days, and the hospital board's decision that it was easier to dismiss a black nurse than admit a white doctor's mistake in front of the city. Caleb had listened without interrupting once, and at the end had said only, "That's not fraud. That's cowardice wearing another man's name," and she'd believed that night that it was settled between them for good. It wasn't settled in town. A notice appeared tacked outside the mercantile unsigned, though everyone understood well enough whose hand had guided it, questioning the credentials of certain persons practicing medicine in this county without proper license or oversight. 2 families who'd sent for Delia in the past month sent instead for the traveling doctor out of Fort Keogh, a man 20 years her senior, with half her steady hand. One of them, the Hargroves, sent word by their eldest boy, who wouldn't quite meet Delia's eyes when he delivered it at the mercantile. Pa says no offense meant, but with all this talk going round, he'd rather not risk it, the boy said, and Delia thanked him for the courtesy of saying it to her face at least, and let it go at that, though it cost her more than she let show. Ezra fielded pointed questions from hands who'd started repeating what they'd heard secondhand at the saloon, and Cole, who'd never fully warmed to the arrangement, quit outright at the end of the week. "Nothing personal," he told Ezra, not Delia, "but I didn't sign on to work someplace with this much talk hanging over it." Ezra didn't argue him out of it, only paid him what was owed, and watched him ride off toward Billings without much regret on either side. Ruth Ann, for her part, refused to hear a word against Delia in her own kitchen, and made that plain enough to 2 ranch hands over breakfast that they didn't bring the subject up again within earshot of her rolling pin. Later, alone with Delia while the bread rose, she said only, "Let them talk. Talk doesn't set a single bone or break a single fever. You've proven what you needed to prove twice over already. Proving it once was supposed to be enough," Delia said. "In Natchez I thought so too, right up until it wasn't. Then prove it a 3rd time and a 4th long as it takes for the fools to catch up to the truth. Wouldn't be the worst thing you've had to do." Caleb rode into town to see Pruitt directly, and came back grim, his jaw set in a way Delia hadn't seen before. "Pruitt's told the bank board he won't recommend renewing the note this spring unless certain arrangements at Crown W are reconsidered before the vote. Meaning me, meaning you." He said it heavily and didn't dress it up or soften it, which she was grateful for, even as it frightened her more than she let show. "And what did you tell him standing in his office?" Caleb hesitated, not long but long enough that she felt it land. "I told him I needed time to think it through carefully. 60 men's wages depend on this ranch clearing that note, Delia. Ezra's family, Ruth Ann's family, Jonah's people down in Miles City who count on what he sends home." He rubbed a hand over his jaw the way he did when he was working something out, before he'd let himself say it out loud. "Maybe if you kept closer to the clinic for a spell, stayed out of the yard when Pruitt or anybody else rides through, let Ezra field the questions till the talk dies down some. Just till it passes." Delia went very still. "You want me to make myself smaller? That's not what I—" "That is exactly what that is, Caleb. That is the precise shape of the sentence the hospital board used on me, dressed up in kinder words. Stay quiet. Stay out of sight. Let the men handle it till it blows over. I have heard that sentence spoken in every voice a man can say it in, and I never once expected to hear it in yours. I'm trying to protect you. You're trying to protect the note." Her voice didn't rise. It went colder instead, which was worse. "I told you the very night we shook hands in that hotel room that I would not be spoken of as anybody's problem to manage. You agreed to that before you'd known me a full evening. I'd have thought 2 months meant more than that promise was worth to you. That's not fair. Maybe not. But I've built my whole life on watching what men do after they say a thing like that, Caleb, not on what they meant by it in their own hearts." She picked up her case packed, she realized only then, without quite deciding to pack it, her hands moving ahead of her resolve, and didn't look back at him, crossing the yard toward the cabin they'd given her the day she first arrived. He didn't follow her that night, and by the time he came to find her the next morning, the cabin stood empty, the bed made with a precision that told him exactly how much thought had gone into leaving it that way. Ruth Ann found the note on the kitchen table, gone into town for a few days, to think the same courtesy he'd have wanted extended to him. Delia took a room at Abernathy's hotel, the same room, though neither of them ever said so aloud later, and spent 3 days tending what patients would still come find her in the Mercantile's back storeroom, saying little, sleeping less. Jonah rode in twice to ask after her, and got the same steady answer both times: she was well, and she would decide her own way forward in her own time. Caleb spent those 3 days doing the thing he should have done the moment Pruitt first rode onto his land. He went back through every ledger his father had left him, this time not hunting for a way to save the note, but for the exact place his father's old thinking had become his own without his ever choosing it. He found it easily enough. In 30 years running Crown W, his father had never once asked a single soul to make themselves smaller for a bank's comfort. He had simply made sure nobody around him ever needed protecting from that particular indignity in the first place by never once giving men like Pruitt the room to ask it. Caleb had given Pruitt that room. No ledger was going to balance that mistake back out. Only he could. Caleb found her on the 3rd morning in the back storeroom at the Mercantile, finishing a dressing on an old rancher's hand. He waited outside by the hitching post, hat in his hands instead of on his head, which she noticed through the window and which cost her something to notice. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," he said the moment she stepped out into the cold. "I'm here to tell you I finally understand exactly what I did wrong, and it isn't the thing I thought it was 3 days ago." "Tell me then." "I asked you to disappear a little, to make Pruitt's discomfort easier to sit with, instead of making him live with his own ugliness out in the open where it belonged. That's not protecting you, Delia. That's the same thing every coward in Natchez did to you, just gentler about it. And I told myself it was different, because I loved you instead of because it actually was different." He said the word loved plainly, like a man laying down a card he'd been holding too long. "I've never said that to you before now. I should have said it before I ever said the other thing." Delia felt her resolve waver and made herself hold it a moment longer anyway. "Saying it now doesn't erase 3 days, Caleb. No, it doesn't, and I'm not asking it to." He turned his hat once in his hands. "Pruitt wants an answer by Friday, and I'm giving him one today, whether you're standing beside me or not, because it's the right answer, regardless of what you decide about me afterward. But I'd rather you heard it from him yourself, plain, than from me telling you second-hand after it's already done." She weighed that a long moment. The fact that he wasn't making his stand against Pruitt contingent on her forgiveness, that the amends had come before the asking, not after. It mattered more, she found, than an apology alone ever could have. "I'll come," she said. "Not because you've earned it all the way back yet, because I want to see it for myself." "That's fair," he said. "More than fair." She went. The bank's front room was crowded by midday. Word had spread the way it always did in Miles City. Ezra, their arms crossed by the door, and Ruth Ann and Jonah with his splint still on his arm, and a dozen others whose lives had touched Delia's hands in the months since the blizzard. Pruitt sat behind his desk with the satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome was already decided in his favor. "Well, Caleb," Pruitt said, folding his hands, "I trust a night's sleep has brought you to your senses on the matter. I've come to tell you the Crown W won't be needing your bank's note renewed." Caleb said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I've wired the cattle exchange in Miles City and 2 outfits in Billings this morning. Between them I can cover what's owed by fall shipping, and I'll gladly pay the difference in interest rather than sign my name to a man who thinks a woman's worth is a line item up for negotiation." Pruitt's composure slipped just slightly a flicker at the corner of his mouth. "You'd risk this entire ranch, everything your father built over." "I'd risk a great deal more than that," Caleb said, "before I let you stand in this room and tell me who belongs on my own land." He turned then not to Pruitt, but to the room full of watching faces. Miss Fontaine set Jonah Teague's arm with her own 2 hands after he was thrown, and it's healed straight because of the care she took. She rode 2 hours through spring current at the Tongue River crossing to bring 3 Kessler children through a fever that would have killed every one of them by morning. Anybody standing in this room who's got an actual complaint about her competence is welcome to bring it to me directly to my face instead of tacking it up unsigned outside the mercantile like a coward. Nobody in the room moved to speak against her. Jonah, in fact, lifted his splinted arm slightly, as if offering it up as evidence for the whole room to see, and a low ripple of something like agreement moved through the crowd, a few heads nodding. Ezra spoke up unasked from the back, plain and gruff. "I doubted her myself first week she came. I'll say that to anybody's face. I was wrong, and I don't mind who hears it." Ruth Ann beside him only nodded once, as if that settled the matter as far as she was concerned, and always had. Even Ada Kessler, who'd ridden in from her homestead, when word reached her, called out from near the door that her 3 children were alive and well because of the woman Pruitt was standing there trying to discredit, and that she'd say so under oath if it came to that. Pruitt looked between Caleb and Delia, calculating, and found no angle left worth playing. "You're a fool, Whitfield. Your father would be ashamed to see this." "Maybe I am a fool," Caleb said. "But I'm not for sale, and neither is she, and my father's opinion stopped mattering to me the day I understood what he was actually asking me to trade away." He turned to Delia, then in front of the whole room, and said the only thing left worth saying, plain as everything else he'd ever told her since the night at the station. "I should have said this the first week instead of 2 years, and 1 bad night, proving it slowly. I choose you first, and the ranch after. If that costs me the note, then it costs me the note, and I'll build it back with my own hands if I have to." Delia felt the whole room's attention settle on her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, didn't shrink from being seen in it. "You already showed me that Caleb Whitfield," she said. "You didn't need the speech to prove it." "Wanted you to have it anyway," said plainly in front of people who'll remember it. She reached for his hand in front of Pruitt, in front of Ezra and Ruth Ann and Jonah, and the whole watching town crowded into that small bank office, and she didn't let go. That night, back at Crown W, she finally told him the 3 days had been less about anger than about needing to prove to herself in her own body that she could still stand alone if she ever had to again. He said he understood that better than she knew, and for once didn't try to fix it or argue her out of it, only sat with her by the fire while she said it close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved to change that. By the time the fire burned low, the space between their chairs had closed on its own, inch by inch, without either of them deciding to close it. The way most things worth keeping seemed to happen between them, slowly, and then simply true. By fall, word of Pruitt's dealings had done more damage to his own standing than to Crown W's 2 other ranchers, hearing how he'd tried to use an old rumor as leverage against a good hand, moved their business to the new bank in Billings, and the territorial board sent a quiet letter suggesting he reconsider certain practices before they reconsidered his charter altogether. He kept his position through the winter, but he never again rode out to Crown W uninvited, and few in town cared to defend him when the subject came up. Caleb and Delia married the following spring on the porch of the main house with Ruth Ann's needle, having remade Caleb's late mother's dress into something that fit Delia like it had always been meant for her, and Ezra, building the benches from fresh-cut pine with his own hands, working late into 2 evenings to finish them in time. The circuit preacher out of Miles City, an older man named Pierce, who'd married half the county over 30 years, asked them the plain question the ceremony required, and Caleb answered it without hesitation. "I do. Have since a night in January I expect I'll be telling my grandchildren about." Delia, when her turn came, found her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I do. And I intend to hold you to every word of it, Caleb Whitfield." When Pierce told Caleb he might kiss his bride, he took her face in both hands, gentle as he'd been that first night with the coat, and kissed her slow and unhurried in front of the whole gathered town, not a claiming, but a promise finally spoken in the one language that had always come easiest to both of them. The porch erupted around them, Jonah loudest of all, and Delia laughed into it, her hand still resting over his heart when they finally parted. The whole town came, even families who'd pulled back when the rumors were loudest. The Hargroves among them, who now brought pies and quiet apologies. Neither Delia nor Caleb made much show of accepting or refusing. Jonah, his arm long-heeled, straight stood up during the supper after, and said a little red-faced at speaking in front of a crowd that he owed this woman his arm and didn't mind saying so twice if anybody needed convincing. Nobody did. It simply didn't matter anymore, which was its own kind of answer to everything that had come before. Delia opened a proper clinic in town the following year. Plain letters painted on a plain sign treating anyone who came through the door, ranch hands and homesteaders, Crow families from the winter range. Caleb had refused to sign away 2 years before townsfolk, who'd once crossed the street rather than speak to her outright. Her father's medical case sat on a shelf behind the front desk, not hidden anymore, not carried like a burden through strange towns. Displayed instead like the credential it had always deserved to be recognized as. 3 winters after the night, Caleb found her freezing on Main Street. Their daughter was born in that same clinic. Delia had insisted on delivering her own child herself right up until the final hour, made that plainly impossible. And it was Ruth Ann, summoned at a run, who ended up guiding Caleb through what needed doing, while Delia gave instructions between breaths, in a voice that stayed steady even then. "You're doing fine," Caleb kept saying, though it was mostly himself he was reassuring. "I know I am," Delia managed, half laughing, half gritting through it. "Just do as I say, and we'll both come through this fine as well." He did as she said, and they did come through fine. And when the crying started, small and furious and entirely alive, Caleb held his daughter for a long moment, before he could make himself hand her back more useful, with that lamp and his steady hands, than he'd ever expected to be in such a moment. They named her Ruth after the first person in Montana who'd handed Delia a cup of coffee without asking anything of her in return. The medical case moved from the shelf to a spot near the cradle that winter, and stayed there through the seasons that followed, not because Delia needed it close at hand any longer, but because it seemed right that the tools which had carried her across half a country, through disgrace and a blizzard and a town's worth of doubt, should rest now beside the next generation of Fontaine hands that might one day choose to pick them up themselves. Jonah Teague stayed on at Crown W long past the 6 weeks his arm needed, and longer still after that, until Ezra handed him more responsibility than a boy his age usually got, and Ruth Ann teased that between the two of them, the ranch would never run short of people who owed Delia something they couldn't repay in money. When new hands came through, asking who to see about a cut or a fever, it was Jonah who pointed them toward the clinic in town, telling them plainly that the woman there had saved his arm and would likely save whatever brought them in too if they had the sense to let her. People in Miles City still tell the story when they tell it at all plainly, not as legend dressed up for effect, just as something true that happened once to two people willing to be stubborn about the right things when it mattered most. A wealthy cattleman who stopped for a stranger at midnight instead of riding past. A nurse who never once stopped proving her hands were worth trusting, no matter how many times she was told otherwise. And a town that took its time getting there, but got there all the same: one broken arm, one river crossing, one honest sentence spoken plainly in a crowded room at a time.
This was never really a story about a snowstorm or a bank knot or even a rescue on a cold street. It was about a woman who refused to let one bedroom back in that define the rest of her life, and a man who had to lose almost everything his father built before he understood that real wealth was never what these old legends said it was. If you're watching this from a small town of your own tonight, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody's business, for better and for worse, tell us where you are turning in from. We, we genuinely love to know. If this story found something true in you, give a like and subscribe if you have already. There's another story coming soon, and we'd be glad to have you back with us for it.